for a typical settler could be 3 bites of shark and then some beer, and then they'd be just good to go until dinner. So, you know, that's can be quite useful, very calorie dense food. But the average temperature in Iceland was slightly higher 1,000 years ago, and this means that their summer was rather longer. So their summer was could be up to 7 months. It was about 6 to 7 months, and therefore the winter was about 5 to 6 months. And they generally divided the year into 2 parts. There was just summer and winter. There was no fall or spring or anything like that. And this is the reason why we celebrate the first of summer in April, when it's sometimes still snowing here. But in the 14th century, it started getting colder, and this was the start of what scientists call the Little Ice Age. They are not entirely in agreement on what it was that happened, if it were natural fluctuations or if it was for some man-made reasons, like Genghis Khan killing loads of people in his conquest from Mongolia, or if there was a volcanic eruption, or what it could have been. But generally here and in very big parts of the world, especially Europe and North America, it started getting a lot colder, and so the summers got shorter. And this is the reason why 1,000 years ago, in the settlement era, the settlers were able to grow grains here like oats, barley, and rye, possibly wheat, but we are not entirely 100% on that one. But the grains would be used for making breads and porridge. People also ate a lot of stews and soups and stuff like that. And the barley was, of course, used to make beer, which was quite important. However, modern experts have estimated that people would drink about 1.5 liters of beer per day, which to us sounds very much, but we do have to remember that their beer was a lot less strong than ours. Theirs would be only 1 to 2% alcohol, while ours is generally 6 to 7%. Then the beverage for getting drunk would rather be mead, and that was partially because mead is made with honey, and so because of the sugar content in the honey, it can become quite a lot stronger. So it could be upwards of 10% alcohol. At least according to the Sagas of the Icelanders, mead was generally imported ready from Norway or Denmark, and was bought for special occasions when it would make sense to get drunk, for weddings or funerals or festivals or stuff like that. They also had milk products, so milk, butter, cream, hard cheeses like cheddar, and skyr. Have you tried skyr? It's the yogurt.
Yeah.
And you as well, I assume, yeah. We have now about 30 different flavors of skyr, but I'm afraid the settlers only had one type, and it could be rather sour. They did not have sugar, so they did not sweeten it with anything, but they would have to stir it up with cream, because before there is anything added to it, plain skyr tends to have a similar consistency to cream cheese or something like that. And they might sometimes spice things up by adding wild blueberries or crowberries, which are in season right now. And again, because they didn't have sugar, they did not make jam from the berries. So they would not preserve the berries in any way. Hello. tickets?
Yeah, as we were in this thing, we can also walk around, you said, or is it not for inside?
Not for inside, no,
Okay.
just for the outside. All right. So everything that required cooking was cooked over a fire, similar to this one. I may have possibly cheated a little bit, but they would have been burning wood, wooden coal, or turf in their fires. Because the average temperature here was higher, there was more wood here 1,000 years ago. And we like to joke that the Vikings used all of the wood, and that's why we don't have any left. But that's not the only thing that happened. Of course, the Little Ice Age affected this as well. But then our sheep have always been around everywhere, and they really love eating trees. It's their favorite food. And they will eat not only the leaves, but also the tree bark. And so the trees eventually give up on trying to grow. But their fire would have also been a lot longer. The Icelandic word for this would translate into English directly as a long fire. Hello.
Hey.
You have tickets?
We do.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Can I see them, please? Yeah. Right. And then go, and then let's have some disinfectants for our hands, and then you can have a seat, but let's try not to touch anything today. Yep. All right. I am almost at the end, but after I finish with them, I can take you back through the beginning. So, yeah. Where was I?
Long fire.
Yes, thank you very much. The fire was a lot longer. The Icelandic word for a fire like this would translate as long fire. And the reason it was so long was to keep a good temperature in all of the house. Then there would be one person in the home whose only job was to keep the fire going at all times. And the reason for that was not only to keep the house warm, but also because the tools to light fires could be rather rare and expensive. And so not everyone had one of those. And not everyone had a peaceful relationship with their neighbors, like Erik the Red, for example. So it could be quite risky to go ask their neighbors for fire. People might either get no fire or too much fire. Yeah. But this right here is to control the temperature. And so if I had soup here in this pot, I would start cooking it by putting it down here. And here it's going to start boiling in a few minutes. And, hello.
Hello.
You have tickets?
Are you getting? Yeah.
Yes. So, thank you. And then you can have a seat, but please don't touch anything.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hello.
There you go. All right. Yeah, so my soup is going to start boiling very nicely in a few minutes, and at that point I will bring it up here, and I'm going to keep it here for about an hour until the meat is all cooked through and nice and tender and ready. At that point then I will bring it up here to keep the soup warm until everyone comes inside for dinner. And if my husband is late for dinner, because he's one of those violent ones who keeps killing my neighbors, then I can also give him cold soup. So, you know, there are all kinds of options here with this system. And then this little guy here is a pot holder. People generally did not have mittens or gloves for holding on to hot things. So I could use this, for example, like this after dinner to take the pot outside, allow it to cool, and then I can wash it to use it next time. Because of course I'm not gonna turn off the fire. So, all right. So the last room here in this house is over here, and that is where all of the food was kept. And the reason we know it was there is because when the archaeologists were digging in the ruins here that this house is based on, one of the few artifacts that they actually found was a piece of a barrel that had contained skyr, and that was in this room right here. So for you guys, that is the end of the tour, but you're of course welcome to ask questions if you have any.
Not at the moment.
Okay. So, thank you so much for coming. I hope you have a very nice rest of your stay. Bye-bye. All right. So, this house here, it is a replica. It is based on ruins that are still here. If you feel like walking up there in this rain today, you can do that after the tour. But the ruins there, they were looked at by archaeologists in 1997, who found out that people had lived in that house for about 10 to 15 years. And that it had been built in the 10th century, so roughly 1,000 years ago. Then this house here was built in 2000, and it is as close to being exactly the same as we possibly can make it. The size of the floor and the foundation is the same, and the doors are in the right places. But all of the woodwork, so everything like this, is driftwood, and it is based on other archaeological digs in Iceland. So this is not exactly what the house here would have looked like, but it's definitely what a house would have looked like. And the reason for that is because when the archaeologists were digging here, they couldn't actually find any trace of wood. So it was not like the wood had rotten or burnt, because there would have been some evidence of that, but it was more like it had just vanished. And so they believe that the original owner of the house had taken all of the woodwork away from the inside and used it to build himself a new house in a different place.
Það eru hvað 7 hjá þið núna.
Já.
Ég með 2 í viðbót.
Okay.
Heldur það sé ekki í lagi?
Jú, örugglega.
Hérna.
Það var COVID þá getur við sem 1.
En það er náttúrulega á ensku, sko.
Já, það er á ensku, þau vita því, sko.
Okay.
Það er kannski bara best að fá eitthvað sæti hérna. Já. Til að vera alveg viss. Það er svona stíga niður hérna á steginni. Já. Þið getið það er hérna bekkur hérna upp á.
Þannig að ef þú stígur hérna upp á geirina, þá getur þú setið þetta uppi.
Það er þægilega, það er ekki hægt að sér aftur upp á líka.
Já.
En þá erum við komin að þolmörkum.
Já, þá komast það ekki fyrir, sko.
Nei, þetta
Bið ykkur að fá ykkur samt smá sprit hérna. Þau voru inni hjá mér áðan.
Þessi hérna?
Já.
Þið eru bara þau ströngustu sem ég hef veit.
Það er svo ofsalega erfitt að sóttu þess að hérna inni. Já. Við erum svolítið ströng, en það er svo skemmtilegt.
Takk fyrir.
Okay, so the original owner of the house here is believed to have been a man of the name of Erik the Red. And the reasons we believe it was him is mostly because there are 2 of our Icelandic sagas that talk about him. And both of those mention that he lived in a valley called Eirikstadir, which is the name of this valley. And they both mention farm names that are still here in this valley. And so therefore we conclude that it couldn't have been any other Eirikstadir valley. Even though there are several other valleys with the same name, there are no other Haukadalur valleys where all of the same farm names are, as are mentioned in these two sagas. Have you heard about the sagas of the Icelanders? Do you know what they are? Yeah. They are the biggest source of information that we have about this period in Icelandic history, roughly 1200 to 1000 years ago. They are maybe not 100% reliable in every single way, because they were told from person to person for about 300 years before they were written down. But these two that talk about this place are among the shortest ones, and they also don't feature very many superhuman feats, like jumping as high as you are tall while wearing full armor, or battling ghosts or stuff like that. They are called the Saga of Eirik the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders. And according to them, Eirik the Red came to Iceland from Norway with his father, and they had been exiled from there for murder. Now, the stories don't go into detail about Eirik's age or which one of them it was that did the murdering. However, after living in Iceland for a few years, Eirik moved here to this valley to marry a woman from here, and her father gave them this land, and and they built a house here, and here was where their children were born, and that included Leif Eriksson, or Leif the Lucky, who is generally a lot more famous than his father. However, Eirik and his family, they only lived here in this valley for a few years. Neither of the stories tell exactly how many, but 10 to 15 years is quite likely. That was because Eirik, he tended to have some anger management issues and killed two of his neighbors here in this valley. So the rest of the people kindly asked him to please leave and never come back, or they would have him tried for murder. So he seems to have packed up everything valuable from his house and left. Taking the woodwork with him would have made a lot of sense, because that would have been a lot cheaper and faster than having to purchase new wood and build everything from scratch. But it also seems he took any other kinds of valuables. The archaeologists could not find any beads or jewelry or anything like that. The biggest clue that they had that there had been people living in that house was the fireplace. But Eirik, he moved his family out to Breiðafjörður Bay, the really big bay here to the west, and there are a whole lot of islands there, and on at least one of them is another farm called Eirikstadir, which generally means place of Eirik or farm of Eirik. And Eirik seems to have managed to live there quite peacefully for about 3 years before he had the misfortune of killing more of his neighbors. And at that point he was exiled from Iceland. And that is when he decided to go to the west. And directly to the west from Iceland there is the biggest island in the world, which is covered with one of the biggest glaciers in the world. But it has this very strange name, Greenland. And so if you've ever wondered why that is, Eirik the Red is the person responsible for that. He came to the east coast first, and on the east coast there are mostly cliffs and it's quite unsuitable for farming. But on the west coast there are some valleys that are similar to this one, quite green and fertile and nice. And he claimed a lot of land there and built himself a nice and big house. There didn't live any other people in that area. In Greenland at the time there lived the ancestors of the modern Inuit people, but Eirik did not have a relationship with them. He did not trade with them, but he didn't kill any of them either, thankfully. So he was rather lonely in Greenland, and there was just him and his family, but nobody there that he could really call an equal or a good friend. So after 3 years he came back to Iceland to advertise Greenland as this really amazing place to live, and that's why he decided to call it Greenland. because he said if the country has a very appealing name, then obviously more people are going to want to move there. And he went around in this area here and in the Snæfellsnes Peninsula here to the southwest, and told people about this amazing place. And he was very successful in this first advertising campaign in history, because from Iceland left 25 ships full of people to go live in Greenland. There would be about 20 to 25 people per ship, so that was roughly 500 people. Eric was then nice enough to reward their trust in him by never killing anyone else after this point, so he seems to have finally gotten some therapy. But he became the chief of the Greenlanders, and he got rich from trading things from Greenland, like walrus skins and walrus teeth and stuff like that. And his son Leif was then the chief of the Greenlanders after his father's death. It is at this point in the sagas that they shift their focus over to Eric's children. He had 4 children, and he had Leif, then 2 other sons and a daughter. And they are all involved in the story of the expeditions going from Greenland to America. And if you are interested in learning more about that, if you haven't already been there, I really recommend the Leif Eriksson Center in Búðardalur. So Búðardalur is the closest small town, and it's about 15 minutes drive from here. And there is a nice exhibition that takes you through the entire story and talks about some archaeological evidence, both from Greenland but also from America, that proves the stay of Nordic people there about 500 years before Columbus. And there is possible to get an audio guide in several languages. It's available in Icelandic, English, German, and French. So if you haven't already been there, I really recommend that as your next stop. But back to this house here, in the first room where we came in is where the people were storing things. So tools, extra clothes, maybe tents or chests that they needed to use for traveling or stuff like that. And then here in this room is where the people would generally spend most of their time. So this is the room where people were sleeping, eating, cooking, making the babies and having the parties and all of that stuff. So there was not a whole lot of privacy in a house like this. For example, Eric's daughter was conceived with someone who was not his wife, and I have absolutely no doubts that his wife knew all about that. But we have 3 beds, so 1, 2, and 3, but they would have had beds over here on this side as well. And then there is a little attic to sleep upstairs. So could you take a guess at how many people would be living in a house like this?
20?
Yes, probably around 15 to 20 people. Mm-hmm. And in Eric's case, like I said, he had 4 children, a wife, and apparently a mistress, and that's 7. And the rest of the approximately 8 to 12 or 13 people would be people who were working for him, people he could rely on to do the farming tasks and stuff like that while he was maybe busy killing his neighbors or something like that. But their beds were really quite small, and the archaeologists, they have been able to confirm the size of this beds from archaeological digs where they found proper wood, wood that was in relatively good condition compared to its age. However, they've also been able to confirm that the people themselves were not hobbits. The people were around 170 to 180 centimeters tall on average. And there would usually be 2 or sometimes 3 people sleeping in each bed. So can you imagine how to fit the 3 of you in one bed at the same time?
Cozy.
Very cozy, yeah. You'd have to be not shy. The likeliest is that they would all be sitting. So resting their heads against the panel here, which is why there's a panel between the beds. Hopefully with some sort of pillow to support their back and shoulders. But by the time the first people came to Iceland, which was around roughly 1200 years ago, it is likely that their ancestors had already been sleeping like this for some generations. So this would have been all that people knew at this time. It sounds rather uncomfortable for us, but both people would have been doing this since they were very small babies. And second, people tended to work really physically hard jobs, meaning that by the time they finally got a chance to sleep, it wouldn't have really mattered what position they were in. But it's not very clear why people started this. Historians do not agree on that, and it is quite likely to have been a combination of things. I have, for example, heard that it was to save on space, so that there would be space for more beds and therefore more people in a house. But I've also heard that this had to do with their bodies, that for example, people tend to snore less if they sleep while sitting, which can be useful if they live with 18 others who are quite as violent as Erik the Red. But I've also heard that people cough less if they sleep sitting, and that could be important because they had a fire going on at all times of the day and night, and so even though the smoke could go outside through the chimney here, there would have still been some smoke in the air because the fire would have been a lot longer. So at least from the edge of this stone here to the end of the box. So that means there would still be some smoke on this side of the house and over there. But then I've also heard that this had nothing to do with any good scientific proper reason, that it was just a superstition, and there were people who were quite afraid that they would die if they slept laying down. And that was not only because they were afraid of being attacked, but had more to do with their knowledge of the body, which wasn't very extensive. There seemed to have been people who thought that laying while sleeping would present too much pressure for the heart and that it would just stop, or that they wouldn't be able to breathe or something like that. Once again, it's not very clear where that may have started, but I do know that seems to have been a superstition in at least parts of Germany up until the 20th century. So quite a stubborn superstition. Then again, in the sagas of the Icelanders, people's favorite hobby seems to be killing each other. So my favorite theory is that people had to stand up really fast to grab their weapons, and those would have looked something like this. All right, I believe I'm now at the point where you came in, but you're of course free to stay longer if you want. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you for your information.
Yes, of course. This sword right here, it is based on a sword that is in the National Museum of Iceland. That one dates back to the 11th century and is now rather rusty in several pieces, but it would have looked something like this originally. Perhaps a little bit sharper. This one hardly even works on butter, but it seems to be meant to be used with one hand, and so if I was strong enough, even though this isn't sharp, I would probably still be able to break some bones with this. But the sword in the National Museum is one of very few swords that have been found from the settlement era. In fact, less than 30 swords from that time have been found in Iceland, which suggests that the swords were mostly for the richest of the rich people. And a much more common weapon would have been this one right here, an axe. And this one is called a bearded axe. It's because of this part right here. So this can be used for for example, to grab onto somebody on horseback and drag him off the horse, so to be better able to beat him up or something like that. But can also be used with two hands to, you know, behead someone or stuff like that. Yeah, it can also apparently be used by spiders to weave, but but in the sagas there are very conflicting descriptions of the effectiveness of weapons. There are passages where people can behead someone with one strike, but then in other places there are also descriptions about how people would have to hit somebody with their weapon 40 times before there was any blood. So, two very, very different extremes. But another quite common weapon at the time was this one, a spear. And this one could be used for stabbing, but also for throwing. And throwing spears was not only done to kill things, but also for sport. So people would have competitions in who could throw spears the farthest. Then we tend to think of these people as really super violent and Vikings, and that they would spend most of their day just killing other people. That is not quite accurate. The parliament in Iceland was established in 930, and modern experts estimate that at that time there lived around 25 to 30,000 people here. However, there are not 25 to 30,000 people mentioned in the sagas. So probably only a small fraction of the population engaged in all this violence. The other people would mostly just be farmers. They would take care of their animals and raise their kids and work in the fields, go hunting sometimes and stuff like that, and usually just do the same thing every single day until they died, which is why it's really hard to write very interesting stories about those people. But because they worked really hard physical jobs, modern experts have estimated that a typical male 1,000 years ago would need to eat about 10,000 calories of food per day. That would have been a lot of what we call calorie-dense food. So their diet can almost be described as a keto diet, but only if they're allowed to drink beer. Modern experts also estimate that people would drink about 1.5 liters of beer per day. Now, their biggest source of food would have been meat, but also they ate a lot of fish. And the meat here mostly came